Hey, everybody. Hey. So good to see you all here. I want to thank all of you for attending this session, which is poignantly entitled, How Many Workers for This Freedom Quilt? Apparently many workers are needed to tell the story. And I want to give special thanks to Elizabeth Castelli, Avi Cummings, and the SNF Planning Committee for making it possible for all of our folks to come and represent a cross-section of the myriad hands that are involved in creating these projects. So the projects I'm referring to are the Domestic Workers History Timeline, which is an interactive timeline that is available and will be available online as a resource, and a series of oral histories that are being produced by Damayan, a Filipino workers organization that supports survivors of trafficking. Before we get started, I just want to kind of think about the context of what we see in popular culture about domestic work. We have a massively critically acclaimed film, Roma, that is being talked about constantly, and kind of portrays our fetish, our culture's fetish for stories that depict domestic workers as political ciphers who live tragic lives, victimized by exploitative conditions, and lack agency to challenge the social structures around them, such as government repression, gender-based violence, forced migration. And in these kinds of films, the household worker protagonist seems strongest or safest when protected by their intimate relationship with their middle class or elite employers and positioned as one of the family. But this persistent victimization narrative is challenged by our panelists. In particular, Premilla Nadasen's book, her 2016 book, Household Workers Unite, through storytelling, documents the way real workers such as Dorothy Bolden and Geraldine Miller, who are Black women organizers, mobilized in both individual and extraordinarily collective ways to disrupt the way that domestic work has historically been tied to the institutions of slavery, settler colonialism, and incarceration, and to change the way that we value both paid and unpaid household work. Beyond the victories of winning Social Security and minimum wage, the fight continues in the movement for basic labor protections. Nadasen masterfully uses oral histories and archival collections to tell this story. And we celebrate the power of activist scholars like Nadasen, who draws these stories from the archival collections. But on this panel, with Premilla's participation as well as other collaborators, we're also asking the question, how do we push back on the archives as spaces of control that keep the historical materials of this movement housed in the academic research complex and away from the organizations and individuals who are continuing the struggle? So we'll have a dialogue between the creators of two collaborative media projects. These were initiated by members of our panel, Monique Nguyen and Riya Ortiz, who represent two organizations in the domestic workers movement, Matahari and Damayan, which will be described soon. So they sought in different ways to have archival material and narrative history made available to their organization. In Monique's case, the interactive digital timeline that would take records from the Sophia Smith collection and other collections and make them available on a mobile device for organizers using history in their day-to-day work. I want to acknowledge, sorry, I'm skipping around because I'm actually trying to think about time. So I want to talk about, we're also going to be talking about the ways that they engage collaborators at Barnard and at Smith to collaborate, to help to create these works. Sorry, that was my timer. And in those collaborations, how they've addressed issues of the tension between grassroots community and the gatekeeping institution, as well as tensions within the movement where there are contested narratives. And some of those have been made invisible over time. I want to acknowledge also that this conversation is taking place in a familiar location where there's been a long record of prior discussions about gender, race, migration, and domestic work, actually hosted by BCRW. Domestic Workers United, a collection of Caribbean, Latinx, and South and Southeast Asian coalition of organizations in New York City, formed in the year 2000, and later became the first affiliate of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And they had several events at Barnard over the years. BCRW hosted the first National Domestic Workers Congress in 2008. Damayan held a forum on gender, race, and migration here in 2011 with Premilla and Nadasen. And there was a conference here about research about domestic work in 2014, which produced critical conversations about the roles that scholars play in the movement. So all of what we're talking about today responds to that lineage of those conversations. Let me introduce our panelists and let them tell you more about these projects. Monique Nguyen is the executive director of Matahari Worker Center in the greater Boston area, where women of color, immigrant women, and families come together as sisters, workers, and survivors to make improvements in themselves and society, and work toward justice and human rights, and to end gender-based violence and exploitation. Monique also helped to found the Massachusetts Coalition for Domestic Workers, which successfully spearheaded the passage of the Domestic Workers' Rights Bill of Massachusetts in 2014. In 2015, she was a participant in the Steinem and Mankiller School for Organizers, and that's where she initiated a collaboration with Smith College faculty to produce the Domestic Workers History Timeline as a way to give Matahari's field organizers, as I said earlier, mobile access to artifacts available in the Sophia Smith collection. Riya Ortiz was born and raised in the Philippines and transplanted to New York City in 2000, and has been organizing in the Filipino-American community and in New York City since then. She's the lead organizer and case manager in Damayan Migrant Workers Association, handling Filipino domestic and migrant workers cases who've experienced labor trafficking, fraud in labor contracting, domestic violence, stolen wage cases, and others. Last fall, Damayan and Premilla Nadasen organized an oral history project where Professor Nadasen's students interviewed Damayan members and organizers who were mainly trafficking survivors. So you'll see a little bit of that project. Premilla Nadasen is a professor at the Barnard History Department. Her recent book, Household Workers Unite, I described. She is president of the National Women's Studies Association and has collaborated recently with the Institute for Policy Studies and the National Domestic Workers Alliance on the We Dream in Black project to mobilize Black domestic workers in the South. Professor Nadasen's book and presence as a guest speaker was integral to the Smith College course, taught by Jennifer Guglielmo in the first iterations of her work on this timeline. Dr. Jennifer Guglielmo is associate professor of history at Smith College. She has published on a range of topics, including working class feminisms, anarchism, whiteness, and the Italian diaspora. Currently, she's working with Diana Sierra Becerra and Michelle Joffroy, who are both here, on this grant-funded collaboration that grows out of the original Domestic Workers History Timeline and now has become a resource for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. In this capacity, she is researching the history of domestic work, developing tools, workshops, and videos for workers and organizers to access historical knowledge and archival evidence. So this project that she'll be talking about really originates in her collaboration with Monique from Matahari. Michelle Joffroy teaches courses on cultural production in the United States, Mexico borderlands, Zapatismo, indigenous cultural resistance, women's narratives, environmental justice, and Spanish for heritage speakers. Joffroy's research focuses on questions of gender, ethnicity, and representations at the intersection of cultural production and transnational social movements. And her course, Domésticas, challenges the representation of domestic workers in Spanish language film and popular media. Her collaboration role in the domestic workers' history timeline involves engaging with affiliate organizations of NDWA to produce materials for the timeline that are based in their own existing cultural work. Diana Becerra Sierra currently teaches at Smith College and is specializing in the histories of women and gender in Latin America. She focuses on social movements and revolutions. As a public scholar, Becerra has collaborated with Salvadoran and US museums and art galleries, global networks of historic sites, and organized with labor groups. Becerra is currently a postdoctoral fellow for the project Putting History into Domestic Workers' Hands, which is the larger project surrounding the timeline. She's developing core political education curriculum to allow current day organizers to learn from their movement ancestors and apply lessons from the past to build on the power of workers today. I ask you to welcome our panelists. Okay, after all that reading, what I'm going to do is ask Riya and Monique to please start our conversation. And I will give an initial prompt and give each set of folks about 8 minutes to answer the question, and in some cases they're going to answer with clips and examples. So what led you, Riya and Monique, to initiate projects that are focused on documenting movement history? And how do you feel a conversation about using the archives in service of domestic workers' movements is also a conversation about power and access in the archives?
So I started organizing domestic workers 10 years ago as a new activist, partly because the organization that I came into, the survivors that were still organizing were domestic workers, and I also most recently did domestic work as an undocumented worker in Houston, Texas. So that the struggles of being a domestic worker was something I gravitated to. But when I was trying to dig into learning about organizing models and how to organize domestic workers, accessing that information was a struggle for me. Like in the contemporary age now, a lot of the curriculum and a lot of the access to history of organizing was really centered in labor history or organizing around other like environmental justice groups. But there was something that finding organizing models for workers, for women survivors, domestic workers particularly was really hard for me. And I only as of recently in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, there's been a big boom around like more academia, more groups looking into the work of domestic workers in history that I knew of, that I had access to as an organizer, that struggled day to day just doing the grind of the work, that I didn't have time to like go to archives. I didn't even know they even existed, to tell you the truth. You know, as a person that was formerly undocumented, even accessing college was a question I had. And in Boston, in a place of such deep wealth in academia, with Harvard, with like different colleges like Wellesley, Massachusetts, like so there were so many schools in the area, but I didn't feel like I had personal access to that to even go up to a place and look for that information. So whenever, over the years, whenever I saw that there was always this gap, and whenever the opportunity arose and I was in this Smith College and surrounded by this project that really centered history around movement building, I was like, wow, these folks get it. And I think this is the time to really like ask this question, can we do this? Can we develop a comprehensive opening for domestic worker history? And that's something that we can also see ourselves in, because it's such a global history of domestic workers. You know, there's so many, this work is as old as time, you know, but it's not being seen and not giving the recognition and respect and dignity that it deserves and captures all the voices of all the workers. So I wanted something that could inspire us, as we built the movement to pass the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights in Massachusetts, that also our members could really look into and be like, wow, I belong part of this. Domestic worker organizing is very, I would say, a unique niche, in organizing. So we didn't feel like automatically aligned with women's rights organization or reproductive justice organizing or domestic violence or sexual assault organizing. So we really had to create our own, make our own road by walking it and building something that we needed. So we asked for something that was accessible, something on the phone that our members who are mostly nannies could pull up a phone and be like, hey, look at this slide. Like, we're part of this. Mamiya Cass, which is our patron saint and historical figure in Massachusetts, she was doing this organizing, talking to other workers on buses, just like how we're talking right now 30 years ago, and showing pictures. And people were like, oh, so you're just not some weirdo trying to talk to me about doing something, like, what are you doing, So it gave us some grounding and some inspiration and feeling that we're connected to a bigger story.
Great. Thanks, Monique. Good afternoon, everyone. So first, thank you to the organizers for inviting the Mayan in this panel, and I'm very grateful and humbled to be part of this panel. And I'm excited to share about the Mayan's work and also learn from the other panelists. So just a brief background about the Mayan. The Mayan was formed in 2002 by a group of Filipino domestic workers in Jersey City, and they were mostly undocumented. And it aimed to build leadership at the grassroots level to eliminate labor trafficking, fight labor fraud and wage theft, and to demand fair labor standards to achieve economic and social justice. Right now, we have about 1,800 members, mostly domestic workers, mainly undocumented, who work in low-wage jobs such as babysitters, nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers. So in the Philippines, our members' class backgrounds are mainly professionals or middle class. So they're professionals, like teachers, government employees, small business owners, and also working poor backgrounds, such as poor farmers, factory workers, and street vendors. But because of widespread poverty and unemployment, they were forced to migrate and work abroad to ensure their family's economic survival. In the US, they mostly become undocumented migrant workers and doing domestic work. So due to the nature of their work, they're vulnerable to exploitation, wage theft, fraud in labor contracting, and even labor trafficking. So at the last panel, there was a lot of conversation about mothers, so I would like to share a little story and how I'm connected, to domestic work organizing. So my mother left Manila in 1988, when I was 10, to come here to the US to be a tourist. Of course, she came here, to work as a domestic worker. And in reality, she was working as a domestic worker because her salary in the Philippines, as a government employee, was no longer enough to sustain her needs. I was crying my eyes out at the Manila airport because I didn't know what was happening. I would learn later in life, that the children, like me, are the first casualties of forced migration and family separation, because we experienced that, as soon as they board the airplane. And then she went back home 2 years later and left again in 1994 because she wasn't able to save enough money, and again, because there were no jobs in the Philippines that could help sustain our family. This time she said that she would bring me to the US. So in 1997, I visited her in New York, and it was my first time to come here. She was working as a domestic worker for a very wealthy white family in Upper East Side. So the husband worked as a vice president in Goldman & Sachs, and the woman was a stay-at-home mom and wrote for a magazine. So when I entered their home, the woman greeted me and then asked me, "Would you like to work for me?" And I was very new here. I didn't know what racism was, but I was being subjected to a very uncomfortable situation, and my mother reacted, very strongly. So after that, we went outside. with the child she was taking care of. I was trailing behind her. It was fall, so the weather was, a little cold, a bit crisp, and then we walked to Central Park. When we went there, she joined other domestic workers, brown mothers like her, who were also taking care of wealthy white babies. So that was my introduction to domestic work organizing in 1997. And 3 years later, I would immigrate, to New York City in 2000. And my mother at that time was still working as a live-in domestic worker. So she was fired by this employer, actually, around 2002. And my mother is a very strong woman figure in my life. She was an activist in the 70s, political prisoner. Fought the Marcos dictatorship in the 70s, and to see her, at home, like doing flower arrangements, it really was nerve-wracking for me. Not because she was, doing a bad job with, arranging the flowers, but it's not how I grew up looking at her. When I was younger, she would write speeches, about labor organizing, and she would make me perform them in front of the school, right? So it was yes. But and then she became an organizer. She actually founded the Mayan. She was one of the founding members. She's very humble about it. She founded it along with other domestic workers who were mainly undocumented, because at that time there was really no visible domestic worker organizing in New York City, or I would say in the U.S., because we couldn't find any model to look at. And I was their first volunteer. I was making their flyers, their newsletter. I was doing their upcoming events, and there wasn't a lot of. Like I said, there wasn't a lot of model out there. But that's why I think it's very important to document domestic worker organizing based on how the women who founded it experienced it, right? To really center, the experiences of undocumented Filipino domestic workers, and not just a piece of history that's, separate from the present, but use it, to gather lessons and move the work, moving forward.
Premilla and Riya. So as collaborators, can you talk about your oral history project? And how has oral history been mobilized by domestic workers historically? And also, how does oral history complicate the way that we think about archives?
So thank you all for being here, and I also want to thank the activists in particular for joining us today. They all have very busy lives and full-time jobs, so thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. So I just want to start by saying I wasn't at the whole conference today, but I was at the prior panel, and I just think the work that's happening around this issue is so incredibly important. I think one of the things I learned from my research about domestic worker organizing is how important archives are for historians and for scholars. But the other thing I learned is how important archives are for activists and for movements. And so I think our project was really about the project I was working with Riya on was really about thinking about the ways in which movements intersect with archives. And I don't just mean movements from the past, right? Because these are movements that are in motion. These are movements that are unfolding, that are changing day by day. And so it's slightly different, I think, to work with people who are community activists right now, who are in the midst of the work that they're engaged in, at the same time that they're trying to document that history. And that history that's documented, I think, is also shaping the narrative that's being told at this very moment about their organizing. So this project emerged, I've worked with domestic workers for about 12 to 15 years, I don't remember exactly, but for a long time. And I've known Linda, Riya's mother, for a very long time, for that period of time. And I think one of the things that was really critical was the issue of trust, right? So because I had a long-standing relationship with Linda, I think that enabled this project to take place. Linda had told me many, many times, she has an amazing story, and you heard a little bit of it from Riya today. Linda has been reluctant to share her stories with a lot of journalists have contacted her, and she's reluctant to share her story. Why? Because she's not sure she's going to have ownership of that story. Okay? It's a movement that's deeply invested in the ways in which their stories are told and having control with how those stories are told and how they're disseminated. And so we had the privilege, and my students were the ones who did the labor, and I had a wonderful student assistant, Valerie Fent, who's here today, who's actually in the master's program in oral history. I could not have done it without Valerie because she had the expertise. Although I've done oral histories, I have not trained people in doing oral history, so Valerie really helped out with that. But we had the privilege of interviewing Riya, Linda, and I think 7 other people who are members of Damayan. And part of our agreement in doing that was that we would not own those interviews. Barnard doesn't own those interviews, I don't own those interviews, and the students do not own those interviews. Some of those are individuals who are undocumented, who have pending cases, so we did it purely as a service to them. We did it and they own it, and if at any point they want to deposit it here, we're happy to help them with that. But I think that question of respect for their labor as activists and organizers was really central to how we imagined this project. And I'm just going to say, you can stop me if you need to, because I wrote several hundred pages on this, so I could talk a very long time.
Yes.
And I want to be mindful of how historians are.
4 minutes.
So I just want to say one thing about the history of the movement in the 1960s and the 1970s, and that is the organizers of the 1960s and the 1970s were deeply committed to also writing their own history. So Carolyn Reed was one of the activists here in New York City. She was a domestic worker and eventually came to head the National Committee on Household Employment, which represented domestic workers. And she actually became sort of a lay historian. She began to attend academic conferences, the conferences of historians. She attended a program at Sarah Lawrence College where she was trained in history, in archiving and history. And she worked with a graduate student, a PhD student in history, and she started something called Our Right to Know. It was a project to document and collect the histories of domestic workers. And should I read something or no? I won't.
Are you guys going to show a clip? Do you have a clip?
Are we going to show a clip?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, I won't
So
read.
then you shouldn't read.
You can see. you can see the work that's happening right now, which I think is more important.
So, yeah, thanks, Premilla. So for the oral history project, we had 9 Damayan members or organizers that were interviewed. 8 were women and 6 were labor trafficking survivors. So for Damayan, the project aimed to document Filipino labor trafficking survivor stories in 4 parts. First is the life in the Philippines, how they met their trafficker, what pushed them to migrate and leave their family and children behind, like the story of my mother, and their lives in the US in the hands of their traffickers and the abuse they experienced. And then 3, how they decided to escape and join Damayan and became a social justice leader. So actually, that's just 3 parts. The stories are also not meant to paint the survivors as victims, but rather as people, or women who have agencies in their lives. It aims to tie the personal to the political, the individual to the community. We tie their personal stories of migration to systemic issues, that contributed to their abuse, such as, big concepts, like US imperialism, ravaging the Philippine economy, which leads to forced migration and family separation. So actually, when you start with storytelling, talking about US imperialism, becomes very smooth because they can connect it to their personal experiences. So from the very beginning, it was also clear that the videos are geared towards other labor trafficking survivors. It's not for, it's for the general public, but first and foremost, it's for other trafficking survivors who are still hiding and maybe living with their traffickers. So we hope that this would inspire them to contact Damayan and escape from their traffickers. They already contact us, through word of mouth and through Facebook. Second, the videos are meant to educate Filipino Americans, allies, supporters, and the general public who aren't aware that what's happening in New York City. So we'd like to show a short clip of one of the interviews. This clip is of Edith Mendoza. She's a labor trafficking survivor who was trafficked by a German diplomat who was working for the European mission.
I'm in the garage. So if they forgot something, especially when they went outside or they have their party outside or meeting outside or from trouble, so if they can come home, it disturbing because there are alarms that make me disturbed because the alarm is too loud. When you open the door, it keeps ringing. And then they keep back and forth, getting something wherever. So it's so disturbance for me. And during nighttime, I cannot even sleep well because there was no cooling in my room. They turn it off during the nighttime. Same thing in the summertime. They usually turn the AC or the heater because they said that the moist going up makes them feeling not good. So what about me?
So what was it like coming to the United States? Did you travel from Qatar to the U.S. or did you come from the Philippines to the U.S.? Did you have time to get ready before you started your new job?
When I was in Qatar, I've been traveling from Qatar because I was working in Qatar before. So there's no way for me to go back to Philippines because my boss, my ex-boss, my formerly boss, the German diplomat, asked me to come quickly. So there's no need for me to go back to Philippines, but instead get my ticket from Qatar to the U.S.
Okay, I think the video actually started a little late, so we missed a few segments, a few seconds, a few minutes from the interview. So Edith Mendoza is a labor trafficking survivor. She used to be a teacher in the Philippines, but because their family business collapsed, she was forced to migrate and become a domestic worker in Qatar, and then was recruited by a diplomat, from who's working here in New York City to work as a domestic worker for them. On the contract, she was given, it said that she would work for 35 hours a week, $10 an hour, so that's $350 a week. But in reality, she ended up working for 80 to 100 hours a week for about $4 an hour. She would start at 6 a.m. And end at 1 a.m. So she only had like about 5 hours to sleep. She was taking care of, 4 kids with 6 bedrooms in the house and 6 bathrooms. And she was doing everything for the family. And I think we missed it on the video. She was also sleeping at the storage area near the garage. And they would turn off the heater, during winter, because it becomes moist upstairs, at the expense of her health. So she was with her trafficker for about 2 years, and we actually met her when she was still living with the trafficker. So for us, it's important to document her story. Like I said, not to further victimize her or re-traumatize her, but to show that there is some empowerment and agency in sharing her story. And that it's actually also healing, for her to talk about her story in front of other workers. So when we first met her, she attended the Workers' Academy, which we organized, where she was sharing this to a room full of domestic workers, 20 others, and they told her that what they're doing wasn't correct, and it propelled her to escape. So 2 weeks later, after the academy finished, she escaped and then became an active member of the Mayan. So for us, it's also, like I said, it's important to connect the personal to the political, the individual to the community, because if we just, let her look at her experience that's devoid of systemic issues, then she would blame herself, that it was my fault. Why did I agree? There will be a lot of guilt, self-blame, and self-shame. But what we really want to provide is, by using their stories, we're showing the systemic issues that were playing out. The racism, the classism, right? And all the systemic abuses, that were happening between her and the diplomat. And that's how we use the stories, and documenting the stories to organize not just her, but also other domestic workers.
Thank you, Riya. So we're going to start talking about the next project, and which starts, as I said earlier, as a collaboration between Monique and Jen. So I'm inviting you to tell the story of Gnarnia Kass, who you mentioned earlier, or another figure who was meaningful for organizers in your organization, and how their legacy in the archives helped to shape your project.
Jennifer, can you pull up the timeline now? I think it's a great time. So Mamiya Cass, I said she's our patron saint of domestic worker organizing in Boston. So in Boston, there's this really long road called Mamiya Cass Boulevard. Hundreds and thousands of people drive and walk down that road all the time, but no one really knew who this woman was. And it's one of our duties now as an organization to uplift her history. So we've uncovered that not only did she help pass the right for domestic workers to have minimum wage and overtime and the right to union in Massachusetts, she was considered a staple in the community. She was nicknamed the First Lady of Roxbury. This is a neighborhood in Boston. And that became, learning about her became a mirror for us and an inspiration for a lot of leaders in our organization as they step up in their leadership. So there's a picture of Mamiya Cass receiving an honorary doctorate from Northeastern University. And this is decades after she's done so much core for activism for her to be recognized. But for us, we only learned about her because while we were drafting the domestic workers law, we needed first to determine what laws do we have access to in Massachusetts. And no one knew. There's this whole rumor and assumption in the United States that domestic workers, because since the 1930s, were left out of labor protections, but no one kept track of, that we knew of in Massachusetts, about how much progress as there has been until this very moment, whenever we had literally a legal intern from our bill drafter went to an archive at UMass Boston and dug up this paper, this letter that Mamiya Cass wrote to a legislator thanking him and asking him to support the bill that they're trying to move through the State House. Can you imagine that? And then we only learned from that letter that we actually had minimum wage and overtime and the right to union for over 40 years. And we didn't know that until we found that letter. And the legal attorneys used that as a foundation for us to add more laws that we wanted. And our work now is implementing that for domestic workers to know that they have minimum wage and overtime and the right to union. So the letter itself, I don't know if Eve was able to pull it up. I just want to show it because the letter itself, because the bill took about 4 years for us to pass, and thanks to the work in New York, it made it quick for us to pass because we were building off a movement and there was so much energy. 4 years is pretty short to pass a bill in Massachusetts. And this letter was the letter that legal intern found. And then it literally was our piece of paper that we printed out and gave to all of our members, and they kept it in their purses. And even for me, when I felt in despair and alone, I pulled up the letter and it's oh my gosh, we have to make this real for Gnarnia Kass. And our members would just keep the piece of paper in their purse. People stopped even asking for the fact sheets for the bill. People are can you give me the Gnarnia Kass letter? I'm all right, I'm gonna print it out and give you a copy, But it became such a important token for us, that we build off a legacy. So that was the main thing, and I just wanted to, even whenever the day that we signed the bill, there's another picture of that. Let me see if at the bill signing. Angela Foster is in the middle wearing that teal shirt. She's one of our key leaders. And her story, she's a nanny working for over 30 years in Massachusetts. And she loves Mamiya Cass. Till this day, she's like, thanks. Anything that's good in her work, she's like, thank you, Mamiya Cass. Like, forget Jesus, forget this, Mamiya Cass, you know? And she even had like that letter in her pocket, and she was watching the governor sign the bill, you know? So that was how so much meant to us. And even till this day, we got our first office, and we decided to, out of all places we're gonna move to, we moved to Roxbury. And then even whenever, there's so much history in a place, like we're just there and people are dropping by and telling us all this history in this one little unit, 400 square feet unit that we have about Frank Sinatra was in the corner, restaurant with Sammy Davis Jr. down the corner, and it used to be a barber shop, you know, and then people were like, oh, Mamiya Cass is down the street, like she used to live down the street, and I'm like, wow, so even in a geolocation, I'm able to like learn so much from neighbors, from people who pass by, and who's validating their histories too. So our work is trying to figure out how to piecemeal everything together. And Jennifer can share more about the timeline if that would be great time to show. But we're trying to create a structure where these stories get captured, you know? So it's not a rigid, bureaucratic way for history to become valid. We're trying to create a timeline that's fluid and accessible, and that we can contribute to. It's kind of like an open source history situation. And we chose this formats for its mobility. You're able to, what do you call it now? Whenever you're able to scale it to different formats, like based on just like, yeah, phones and whatnot. So even if you make the screen smaller, it formats to a phone's size, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monique, and thank you, everyone. I feel enormously honored to just be a part of this session and be able to be up here with these amazing people. So I don't want to take up much time. You can see the website at the top here, so you can go and check out the timeline. Please feel free to look at it. Feel free to email me. This is still very much a draft. We're working on revising it over the next several months. NDWA has hired software developers through this grant that we received to come up with a new format that's a lot more versatile and allows, right now it's very linear. It's on Timeline.js, which was great for the first draft and great when we were just beginning, but now that it's over 130 slides, it's just unwieldy, right, to try and move from left to right. So we hope by April to have the new format working, and it still will be smartphone accessible and enable to folks to look at different layers of history. So we're producing slides that you'll see more about the history of how the timeline came to be here. It started, the very first draft, like Premilla, I worked with my students, because, you know, as faculty, we're so busy, and so you think about how to bring in a new project into your life, and it's like, oh, I'll teach a course around it. And so I taught a course on the history of domestic worker organizing and had students help me with the first draft, which was actually kind of wonderful, because we brought Matahari, and Monique came regularly, met with the students. A whole team of Matahari organizers came and evaluated the draft. The students began to learn to think about, how do I write in more accessible prose? That's the first thing we heard when we began to work with organizers, was how, as academics, we're teaching our students to write in extremely inaccessible language, and when they go to work with them, they have to untrain them, and they don't even let them write things for several years. And so Michelle and I immediately thought, oh boy, we need to completely reimagine how we're teaching writing. And so teaching students how to write slides was really quite wonderful. You know, pick an image, tell a story with that image. Oh, here I'm doing the same thing again. Thank you. So, so the timeline has, right now, it has many, we've been working closely. Thank goodness we have Monique is still with us, working really closely as we move to this next level. We were working for about 3 years with just our small team, Michelle and I, with Monique and Matahari. And then as the fates would have it, and the universe saw to it that we would move to this whole new level. We received a very generous grant from a private donor who is very committed to making archives more accessible to social movements, and who believed in this project and decided to invest in it. And so we have the resources now for 2 years to really take this to a whole nother level. And NDW, we're working closely with the National Domestic Workers Alliance to build something that can help to train their 50,000 plus members in the history of domestic worker organizing. And help them also, what we imagine for this project is that it will be co-created. We're in the moment kind of producing a draft of materials that we'll share, and then this summer, and fall, we're gonna go out to affiliates, Diana, Monique, Michelle, and I, and with a couple of folks from NDWA, and just bring it to affiliates and see how people work with it, collect their local knowledges and stories, like the Gnarnia Kass story, right? Folks all have their local patron saints and their local stories that we want to incorporate it in. But we wanted to have a draft that folks could work with, and so right now the slides are focus on the transformation of the industry of domestic work as a sector, and also the history of resistance and organizing. And of course, we think about resistance in really complex ways, from the everyday kinds of ways that domestic workers hold on to their sense of dignity and sense of self, and undermine and subvert authority in subtle and covert ways, to just gathering with friends on the weekend with other workers and telling stories and building a common sense of collective identity through that, to mutual aid societies, to coming together and pooling resources to provide for sickness and death benefits, and to throw parties and have fun and get dressed up and feel good, right? Feel good about yourself and your community. And then, of course, strikes and work stoppages and, of course, unions and organizing, right? The first national, as Premilla Nadasen documents so beautifully in her book. I recommend that everybody go and read that book. It's an incredibly beautiful book and such an important contribution to the scholarship. And how the first national movement of domestic workers emerges in the 1970s out of the civil rights movement. So we have slides here you'll see that are both focus on domestic workers, but also on that kind of have like big picture too, that really kind of help to explain how domestic work is rooted in the histories of slavery and colonialism, how capitalism as a system emerges out of slavery and colonialism, and is from the very beginning a racial engendered system that is imagining and creating domestic work as a category that's extremely low paid and unpaid. And so we begin there and kind of move forward to understand kind of what are the major, this is what we heard from organizers, is they want to understand these kind of major systems they want to learn history, and they want to understand how power has operated historically, as well as to think about these histories of resistance. So we will also have kind of a series of slides that are just definitional, right? Like what is decolonization, what is anti-Blackness, et cetera. And then I'll just, so here right now we've done a lot of these big slides for the beginning of the timelines, and we have more to do for the end. So if you go through it, that's why they're all kind of bunched up at the beginning. And of course, we root this histories, as I said, in Black women's histories of resistance under slavery, and then the emergence of like the first strikes, the washerwomen's strikes in post-emancipation Atlanta. And I'll just show you, just to give you a sense of one more slide here, I think. Oh, here's the Gnarnia Kass. We tried in here to kind of embed stories, like my hope for each of these slides, even as we transition to the new format, is that they act as doorways, so you can go into a story through a video or through access an oral history or access a document, so that we're producing an archive right through the timeline that folks can kind of interact with. And then Diana will share more about and Michelle, about what we hope for through the workshops. So I hope you, again, please look at the timeline. Please write to me. Feel free to write to me. My email is on the first slide or second slide, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as you look at it.
So the question for you, Diana, was about how you plan to co-construct a curriculum around the timeline with local affiliates of NDWA around the country, and what are the challenges that are presented by that process?
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deanna, and just to give you a sense of my personal connection to this history, my mom was a domestic worker, and I was undocumented along with my mom for about 20 years, so a lot of my political consciousness comes from domestic workers and from the serious shade that they throw at their employers when they all get together and talk shit about, like, how this woman won't even, like, clean her own fucking underwear. So the way that we're starting with this curriculum is starting first. Any good political education curriculum has to start from the political goals itself. And NDWA outlined a set of political goals that they're trying to advance to build their organization, to build a movement. And one of the key goals is expanding the organization, trying to mobilize about 10% of the labor force, or 250,000 workers, and trying to create various scales of leadership and of engagement, and to build solidarity among the different industries. So nannies and care workers and elderly care workers, they don't always see themselves as having a shared struggle. And also because of demographic differences, there are divisions in the movement. And so it's a question of how to build solidarity and unity and proactively address the tensions and conflicts and the areas that need some healing. And so we're approaching history as a way to provide concrete lessons and political frameworks for organizers. They already do this, but it's to create that to be much more accessible and intentional. And we're approaching the history as an opportunity for current day organizers to be in dialogue with their movement ancestors, to expand what we think is possible. So why is it that in particular moments in time, revolution is seen as something that is on the table? In other moments, it's not. And why is it that solidarity emerges, and in other cases, it breaks down? And so we also see history as an opportunity to think as a good organizer, to think about power. It's not just this background of, like, let me tell you some interesting facts in this background, but when you can train organizers to think historically, they're thinking about why is shit fucked up and how do we dismantle it? And that kind of thinking, I think, is really necessary for good organizing. And to give you an example of that, in the timeline, there is this really beautiful history of Black communist women in New York City who were denouncing and organizing domestic workers, especially in the 1930s, who were working on street corners and being paid horrendous, horrendous wages. And you see how in this critique of domestic work, they have a really expansive vision for social justice, and they connect the liberation of domestic workers to anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggles. And so that's a really important tradition for domestic workers to know that they're a part of that tradition. And it also provides an opportunity for the movement to question some of the way that it narrates its own histories. So for example, depending on the organization, depending on the movement, broadly on like progressive organizations, there sometimes can be a tendency to attribute intersectionality to like the 1990s, for example. And in an effort to critique whiteness and white liberal feminists, entire movements are dismissed as being racist. So that erases the radical women of the 1970s, or the feminist women, the Black communist women of the 1930s, let alone all the other traditions from which these domestic workers come from. So in terms of format, the project is trying to serve different movement spaces. So because in an organization at this scale, that's my own timer, not everyone is going to, people are going to be participating in different ways, so the curriculum has to be able to reflect that, and the timeline has to reflect that. So we're creating the timeline, and we're going to create a curriculum that can be used in different spaces. One, in facilitated spaces, where movement leaders can lead those workshops, and so we'll have an entire curriculum with workshops and exercises that's connected to the timeline. One where workers are just scrolling through the timeline and aren't just having conversations on buses and prompts that are appropriate for that kind of interaction. And then one where it's just someone who is not connected to any organization and someone who's really isolated. So that's the format. Like Jennifer said, we're gonna bedazzle the timeline so that it's more engaging. And in terms of process, we've been working with we're working on two different scales. NDWA is a huge organization, and it's really important to operate on both scales, to work with the local affiliates and go to them and collect their stories in their archives, and to also be working on the other scale, which is the more national scale, around the political goals. And the way that we've been doing this is like, what are the kinds of questions that you're interested? If you can talk to your movement ancestors, how would you approach that history? And what are the current day problems that you're facing in your organizations that you would like some tools to grapple with? So for example, when we went to an NDWA Congress, women were talking about, the sexism in the community, and how have people fought against patriarchy? And I was like, girl, I got you. Like, I'll hook you up with some sources. So those are the kinds of, we're approaching it that way for folks who want to know about boycotts and they go to it, but other people who are facing other problems, concrete organizing problems.
So our last panelist is Michelle Joffroy. Michelle, would you like to talk about cultural production and how that will become part of the Timeline Project?
Yeah, and I'll keep this brief, just in the interest of time and questions and things. So I'm Michelle Joffroy, and I'm part of the project, and like everybody else, quite grateful for the opportunity to share this beautiful work and to learn more about the ways in which history is actually one dimension of this, but I really like what you said, Premilla, about these are movements that are evolving and shifting and changing now, and how to capture that is a challenge and also an ethical obligation of any archiving project, and certainly one that we live and feel strongly about. I enter the project with a different set of questions. I come into this project firmly believing that domestic workers are making cultures that are an alternative to the toxic, racist, sexist, anti-Black, and phobic mainstream that they live and work in on a day-to-day basis. And if that's the assumption, then what I'm curious to learn from domestic workers at both scales that Diana describes, the local affiliates and then the national level, what are the cultures that you are making, and what are the icons and the iconographies and the practices that you yourselves have created to make a culture that is not contingent upon getting that legislative bill passed, but in fact, although it's enmeshed in that, but in fact is about making something that bonds us, that creates a possibility and a future for us. And a lot of that work is being done, has been done historically through actual cultural production. So flyers, well, there's one image that I wanted to share with you. It's an image produced by a group called Chirla, which is the California Human. Oh, thank you. So there she is. So this is Super Domestica. Super Domestica is created by the Coalition for Human Immigrant Rights in Los Angeles. She's created in 1994 as part of a campaign to get out a Know Your Rights agenda, right? To try to bring together domestic workers in Los Angeles who are primarily Central American and Mexican in terms of their composition. So the Super Domestica becomes the icon that draws everybody and circulates within domestic worker circles, and they are talking to each other through Super Domestica. Super Domestica can signal, and actually did signal to many people, a reference to Wonder Woman, right? And very quickly, the domestic workers were clear. This is not Wonder Woman, this is Super Barrio. Super Barrio was a social activist priest in Mexico City who dressed up as a wrestler and aided squatters groups in Mexico City to take back land that they had been dispossessed of. So Super Barrio is the conversation that's flowing between and among domestic workers through an iconography of their own making. What is the heroism that they're celebrating? It's fine if some folks would like to see Wonder Woman in Super Domestica, but domestic workers are seeing something else and they're saying something else. And it's a much more radical conversation that they're having. And so this is the kind of thing I'm hoping to learn about through the affiliates, and also to work closely with them to facilitate the illumination of the co-creation that they're involved in. This is a vast geographic space in the United States, and this is a highly international, transnational movement. So how do we tell each other's stories through poetry and icons that connect us and our home cultures, and offer a space that is not contingent upon any state power to legitimize the work we're doing, but in which we create for ourselves a culture of possibility and dignity. So I'll leave that there. Hopefully that's what's going to happen, and it'll be in the timeline, right? So, yeah.
Our last question was about tensions that have come up in this work, but I think that we are in a good position to just open the floor and have 2 questions before we close.
Hello, thank you for sharing all of your projects. I guess my question is if you could share how each of your projects accounts for the possibility of trauma and re-trauma for either people who are organizing or the people who are subjects of the work. Thank you.
So that's a really great question, and thank you for asking that. It came up in these interviews that we did. It was very difficult. A lot of people were sharing stories that were very harrowing, that were incredibly painful. And so there were a lot of tears shed in the interviews. There were several, myself and the students are not equipped to deal with this. The organization was very deeply involved in every aspect of the interviews the students did. So there was a member of the Mayan who was at every single interview. So we never just had a student and professor along with an interviewee. They were briefed in advance. We actually had a kind of opening reception where we met one another and talked to one another. The students had a training or an orientation around the organization. And so we tried the best we could, but they're still very painful stories. And as Riya said, I think part of the process of telling the story was also about the healing process. And I'll let her talk a little more about that.
Thank you. So I guess for us, it's a question of storytelling for whom, right? Because there is storytelling or doing media interviews and speaking interviews where the worker is, up here on the stage, crying her eyes out in front of, a lot of people who couldn't relate to her because that's not their reality, right? So for us, we have a different take on that. Our take is that first there has to be consent. The worker has to agree, to share her stories, right? And we explain why, So it's meant to inspire other domestic workers, other trafficking survivors, and it's meant to move them, right? So, there's this revolutionary philosopher who said, philosophers study the world, but the point is to change it. That's Karl Marx. So he said, just to be straight. That's our point, for doing storytelling. It's not just to share stories for the sake of sharing stories, but it's to also help facilitate their healing. Because the more they share, it's like opening an old wound, but it's cleaning the wound. It's not just covered by a scar, and it's rotting inside. You're actually opening the wound and, cleansing it, right? So that's the process of storytelling for us. But trauma and re-traumatization is also real. So for most of the interviews, I was present, and I didn't actually expect that I was getting the secondary trauma. So I was literally out for a couple of days. And it was difficult because I knew that I had to be there, for the workers. So boundary setting is also important, right? Just doing your own self-care. So how do you take care of yourself after, doing 3 sessions at a time? I'm also a case manager, so when I talk to workers, I only do it 1 at a time. So hearing 3 stories, seeing the worker, crying, it has its own impact on me as well, right? So we just have to be mindful of that. So I mean, that's also individual and collective. I process it, on my own, right? I have my own self-care practices, but I also talk to the other staff members about it, because I work with trafficking survivors, so they're not. I'm the only or one of the few non-domestic workers, in our organization.
Is there another question? I would love to answer this if there's another question.
Question?
Okay.
There was-
Sorry. Let me answer this quickly, and then we can ask the question too. For us organizers, we were getting to a point when we were also fearful of what things would open up if we dug into history too much. And also our readiness as organizers to hold space for people. We had to equip ourselves and prepare ourselves. But we're also facing a moment when we recognize that if we don't share access to history, that's also trauma. A lot of people are surviving so much violence because not knowing the history that they're coming from, and also impacted by the daily violence of economic violence, racism, sexism on their lives and their bodies, that we had to figure out how do we dignify ourselves by giving ourselves access to talk about those things, So we use the tool of the timeline to give us entry points, and then we cater based on our knowledge of our membership, our readiness as organizers, preparing our partners who would help us hold space, like social workers, other interpreters, and training everybody to prepare us talking about racism, talking about how sexism impacted them, surviving domestic violence, but also surviving sexual violence and being exploited as a worker. It's so complex, history is like an entry point for us to kind of decipher the complex ways that we deliver, and also open up space for each other. And history has become such a tool for that. And denial, through colonization, imperialism, history was something that was targeted first for civilizations. They burned things down. They knew that cultural artifacts and access to your history was the key point for you to lose a sense of self. So our work is uncovering that and reclaiming our museum and our archive and our kitchen cupboard of things that are important to us. So that's it for that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Monique, and thanks to all of the panelists. Thank you for sharing your stories.